Sometime around November 1929, somewhere in southeastern Nigeria, over 1,000 women armed with nothing but palm frond, pistols, and a local war chant older than the colony that was then ruling over them, surrounded the offices, courts, and warehouse of the British Empire, only to be shot at. That very day, over 100 persons died. This is the story of the Aba massacre. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. It helps the video reach more audience. Thank you very much. The women weren't rioting. They were actually just waiting around, standing for the most part. In old Igbo tradition, there is this culture called sitting on a man. That was a formal way of protest where the women hold a wrongdoer's compound captive. They will sing song mocking his conduct, and they will refuse to leave until justice is done. That is exactly what happened in 1929. The women sat on the British Empire. By the time it was over, colonial police and soldiers had opened fire on unarmed women in two separate towns. Official record admits that at least 55 died, but local count says that the real number was over 100 persons, including the wounded civilians. Now let us understand this and how it happened. The British called it a riot. The women called it a war. This is the file on the Aba Women's War. To understand why a head count nearly toppled the British rule in the Niger Delta, you have to understand what colonial administration actually was. You see, the colonial administration was a machine built to extract value at the lowest possible cost, run through local men who were handed power they had never received before. That system was called indirect rule. Britain didn't want to govern every village directly. It's too expensive and too exposed for them. So they appointed warrant chiefs. Warrant chiefs were local men giving British-backed authorities to collect taxes, to enforce colonial laws, and to keep order. The problem, and it's a problem that will show up again and again in this file, is that the British imposed a hierarchical single ruler model onto a region that had never worked that way. Igbo political tradition was decentralized. Villages governed through council of elders, age grade association, and critically, women assemblies, with real authority over markets, trade, and community discipline. There was no king to appoint, so the British invented one: warrant chiefs. The warrant chiefs were often outsiders with no traditional legitimacy, propped up entirely by colonial guns and colonial paperwork. By 1929, these warrant chiefs had spent over a decade extracting bribe, seizing properties, and enforcing forced labor. Because the only accountability, they answered, was to Britain, not their own people. Then came the trigger. In 1928, colonial administrators had already imposed a direct tax on Igbo men for the first time. The following year, word spread that officials were preparing to count women and their properties, the assumed first step towards taxing women too. For a population already stripped of political voice and are now facing the loss of economic independence, this wasn't a bureaucratic exercise, it was existential. On November 18, 1929, in a small town of Oloko, a census enumerator named Mark Emeruwa entered the compound of another woman named Wanyeruwa to count her household, her goats, sheep, and family. Now, this lady called Wanyeruwa asked him directly, was he here to count her or her properties for the purpose of taxation? Accounts on this differ on exactly what was said and what was not said, but what is certain is that a confrontation turned physical, and Wanyeruwa left, believing that the answer to her question asked earlier was yes. She took the answer to the Women Council and within hours, Runners carrying palm frond, a traditional call to mobilize, were moving between villages. This wasn't a spontaneous chaos. It moved through an existing organizational structure that Igbo women already had. Market networks, kinship lines, and the Mikiri, women governing councils that predated colonial rule entirely and had simply been ignored by the British the whole time. By the next day, thousands of women had converged on Oloko, demanding the warrant chief responsible, a man named Okugo. He is notorious for extortion, to be removed and tried. He was. British authorities, trying to de-escalate whatever was happening, arrested Okugo and sentenced him to 2 years. It should have ended there, but instead, it went regional. Word of the Oloko victory spread across Igbo and Ibibio territory in just a couple of days, through the same trade and kingship network that had always let women coordinate independent of any colonial structure. What followed was one of the most sophisticated mass mobilization in the early 20th century Africa. Estimates put the number of women involved at anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 women alone, across a region spanning roughly 6,000 square miles. Their tactics were culturally coded and deliberately non-lethal. The women besieged native courts, tore down the roof of buildings associated with warrant chiefs, and forced the release of prisoners. They sang derisive chants naming corrupt chiefs by name, dancing in coordinated numbers meant to shame and overwhelm rather than kill. They demanded that warrant chiefs surrender their caps of office, the only physical symbol of British granted authority. See, the entire protest architecture was built on a pre-existing indigenous accountability system. Sitting on a man was how Igbo women had disciplined abusive husbands and corrupt elders for generations. In 1929, they simply pointed that same weapon at the colonial state. The British had no framework for this. Their intelligence report from the period revealed a striking blind spot, repeatedly describing the protest as irrational, hysterical, or externally instigated, because colonial administration simply could not conceive that Igbo women held independent political authority worth taking seriously. That blind spot is what turned a protest into a massacre. By mid-December 1929, the protest had reached Opobo, and the town that would give the name Aba Massacre. In Aba, women gathered outside European trading stores and the native courts, demanding an end to taxation and the dismissal of corrupt chiefs. However, colonial administrators became increasingly alarmed and called in the troops. So, on December 16, 1929, in Opopo, colonial police and a contingent of soldiers opened fire on a crowd of women. Official colonial inquiry figures recorded at least 32 women killed in Opobo alone, with dozens more wounded. Days earlier, at Utu Etimekpo, similar clashes left further casualties. Across the full campaign, the official death toll stood over 55 women killed and more than 57 wounded, figures the colonial government itself was forced to publish. However, Nigerian historians and oral record have long argued the true number was significantly higher, given undercounted casualties in more remote engagements. Not a single British soldier or officer died in the entire uprising. That imbalance is the whole case file in one sentence. An unarmed protest movement built on ritual and songs met with rafale. The British colonial government's response afterward is almost more sad than the massacre itself. Facing international scrutiny, they convened two official commissions of inquiry, and both were forced to conclude that women's grievances were legitimate, that warrant chiefs were systematically corrupt and that the entire taxation fears were justified. In other words, the colonial state investigated itself and confirmed that the protesters had been right all along. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable in a different way. You see, the Aba Women War forced the Britain to abolish the warrant chief system in the region and eventually appoint women to serve on native court for the first time. But if we look closely at what kind of victory that was, the British didn't restore the pre-colonial governance system the women had already been defending. They redesigned the colonial one, slightly less brittle, slightly more consultative, still fundamentally external, still fundamentally extractive. This pattern is worth naming plainly because it reoccurs constantly in this region's history. Colonial and post-colonial power in Nigeria has repeatedly responded to mass unrest not by dismantling the structure that caused it, but by patching the specific failure points that got exposed, while leaving the underlying architecture of imposed unaccountable local authority intact. The Aba Women's War isn't just remembered as clearly as it should be, partly because it doesn't fit neatly into either a purely nationalistic narrative or a purely feministic one. It was led entirely by women using indigenous method against a system that had never once considered them a political constituency worth listening to, until they made it impossible not to. It is called the Aba Massacre not because it happened in Aba. The killing majorly happened in parts of Akwa Ibom and Rivers states, but it is named that way because the offices of the warrant chiefs and the British barracks were in Aba, somewhere in Abia State. That is the file on that. Over 100 women, zero soldiers. This is the Aba Massacre.